You are listening to Kill Hitler, the July Bomb Plot, written and narrated by Mark Felton on War Stories with Mark Felton. Throughout 1943, a series of assassination attempts were made against Adolf Hitler by German army officers attached to high command. All failed. The active anti-Hitler resistance inside Germany was becoming increasingly desperate throughout 1944 as the war situation deteriorated on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Many in the army wanted Hitler removed and the war run quite differently. But Hitler's security was growing tighter as he withdrew from the public, and junior officers acting as aides to the generals and field marshals were now forbidden from being in Hitler's presence during military conferences. Hitler seemed to sense a latent danger to his power from the largely aristocratic and conservative officer class. The chances of introducing a bomb into a conference or at Hitler's private home was becoming ever more remote. What was needed was an officer of sufficient rank who would attend military conferences and still be in close proximity to the Führer. By mid-1944, only 2 men fitted this description. One was 43-year-old Generalmajor Helmut Stief, a man who was described by one senior plotter as nervy as a racing jockey. The other was a man of immense personal courage, the new leader of the resistance movement, who had played such an important part in recruiting the men who had already attempted to kill Hitler, Oberst or Colonel Klaus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg. Germany's latest saviour was also its last great hope, the only plotter senior enough and brave enough to stand next to Hitler and kill him. The Stauffenbergs are one of southern Germany's oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families. Klaus von Stauffenberg was born at the family castle at Jettingen near Augsburg in 1907. He was commissioned into the Reichswehr in 1930 and took part in the invasion of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in 1938. He wrestled with his conscience regarding Nazi ideology, on the one hand supporting many of Hitler's foreign policy goals, and on the other despising the brutality and racism of the Nazis. His strong Catholic faith was deeply offended by the ill treatment of the Jews, a reaction shared by many of his brother officers and fellow plotters. In 1939, Stauffenberg served with distinction in the Polish campaign, and it was during this campaign that the anti-Hitler resistance first approached him. His uncle spoke to him at length about the aims of the resistance, but at this stage Stauffenberg was averse to breaking his oath of allegiance to Hitler and declined to join. As with many of his class, the breaking of an oath was practically inconceivable under any circumstances because it impugned an officer's family honor. Stauffenberg won the Iron Cross First Class during the invasion of France, but what he saw and heard in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, both appalled and disturbed him. The mass execution of civilians, the roundups, and the deliberate alienation of conquered populations disgusted Stauffenberg, leading him to finally join the resistance in 1942. His conscience overrode his strong sense of patriotism and loyalty when the true amoral nature of Nazism was revealed to him. But, like all of the other plotters, overcoming a reluctance to commit treason was a terrible struggle. Posted to the organizational department of Army High Command, Stauffenberg tried to soften German occupation policies, also attempting to recruit local volunteers for the German armed forces. He wrote a proposal concerning the correct treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Unfortunately, none of his proposals were adopted, adding to his frustration and determination to effect a change of leadership. Posted to the Africa Corps in Tunisia in 1942, he was promoted to Oberstleutnant, or Lieutenant Colonel, and made operations officer of the 10th Panzer Division. During Field Marshal Rommel's advance through the Kasserine Pass in early 1943, Stauffenberg's job meant that he was constantly driving between units in his Horch staff car. On the 7th of April, Royal Australian Air Force P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter bombers pounced on the convoy that he was travelling in. Stauffenberg suffered appalling injuries, including losing his left eye, right hand, and several of the fingers on his left hand. After 3 months of hospitalization in Munich, Stauffenberg recovered and was awarded the Wound Badge in gold and the German Cross in gold, one of Nazi Germany's most prestigious awards for bravery. After a suitable period of convalescence, he was promoted to Oberst and appointed Chief of Staff to Generaloberst Friedrich Fromm, Commander-in-Chief of the Replacement Army. 55-year-old Fromm could be best described as a fence-sitter. He never fully committed himself to Stauffenberg's plotting, but he did agree to keep quiet in return for a high position in any post-coup government. In the end, when push came to shove, Fromm sided with Hitler, with devastating consequences for Stauffenberg and the other plotters. The replacement army had a dual role in Nazi Germany. Its primary job was to train soldiers as replacements for first-line divisions. Secondly, in the event of a coup against Hitler or internal disorder, the replacement army was to activate Operation Valkyrie. The original Valkyrie plan, as created by General der Infanterie Friedrich Olbricht's staff, would see replacement army formations activated to guard vital points across the Reich. Awarded the Knight's Cross for personal bravery during the invasion of Poland, Olbricht had been appointed Chief of the Armed Forces Replacement Office at OKW in 1942, the Armed Forces High Command. Olbricht had been wary of the Nazis since the early 1920s and joined the plotters. Unfortunately, only Fromm could activate Valkyrie, so from the beginning the plotters, led by Generalmajor Henning von Tresckow and Stauffenberg, sought to enlist a reluctant Fromm to their cause. After the failure to assassinate Hitler on his plane ride back from Smolensk on the 13th of March 1943, Olbricht felt that the original Valkyrie plan was inadequate and that the replacement army should be used to overthrow Hitler and his government even without Fromm's cooperation. Tresckow created Valkyrie II, providing for the swift gathering of army units into battle groups ready for action. During August and September 1943, Tresckow revised and further expanded the plan, issuing new secret orders. The operational orders now began with the words, "The Führer, Adolf Hitler, is dead. A treacherous group of party leaders has attempted to exploit the situation by attacking our embattled soldiers from the rear to seize power for themselves." There followed detailed instructions for replacement army battle groups to occupy the main government ministries in Berlin, Heinrich Himmler's headquarters at the Hockenwald in East Prussia, radio stations and telephone exchanges, other Nazi offices, and the concentration camps. The plan relied upon tricking the replacement army into working for the plotters in eradicating the Nazi government by creating a false coup attempt by the SS. The ordinary troops would believe that the Nazi leadership was traitorous and had to be removed. Tresckow was confident that the troops would obey, as their orders came from replacement army headquarters and looked genuine. The Allied invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 convinced 36-year-old Stauffenberg that the writing was on the wall for Hitler's Germany. In his opinion, it was the sacred duty of loyal German officers to get rid of the Führer and to conclude an immediate armistice with the Western Allies to prevent further pointless bloodshed and the ultimate destruction of Germany. From September 1943, Stauffenberg had been the driving force behind the resistance and behind every plot to kill Hitler. As the failures mounted, Stauffenberg was becoming increasingly doubtful that the resistance would succeed. The assassination must be attempted, urged Stauffenberg's friend and fellow conspirator General von Tresckow. Even if it fails, we must take action in Berlin. Tresckow believed that they had to show the Allies that not every German was like Hitler. Count von Stauffenberg had first met Hitler in person on the 7th of June 1944, the day after D-Day. He accompanied his boss, General Fromm, to a military meeting at the Berghof, Hitler's private home on the Obersalzberg in southern Bavaria. Hitler greeted the war-scarred hero warmly, carefully taking the Count's one remaining mangled hand into both of his and staring intently into Stauffenberg's one eye, as was his wont with new faces at headquarters. Stauffenberg was unfazed by Hitler's intense greeting and could not see the so-called hypnotic magnetism that so many other officers claimed that Hitler exuded. The meeting was limited, aside from Fromm and Stauffenberg, to Hitler, Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, the crawling sycophant Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and Albert Speer, the armaments minister. Stauffenberg presented a revised draft of Operation Valkyrie to the Führer for his approval and signature, though this plan was not the one that Tresckow, Olbricht, and Stauffenberg would actually transmit to the replacement army. Hitler listened and then signed the plan into official policy, undoubtedly pleased that he was so well protected by his Wehrmacht forces. During the meeting, Stauffenberg was afforded the opportunity to study Nazi Germany's most powerful leaders up close. He was disgusted and repulsed by what he saw. He described the atmosphere as degenerate and fetid, and claimed that he had found it hard to breathe. Of his fellow participants, he noted, only Albert Speer gave the impression of normality. The others were, he said, patent psychopaths. On the 6th of July, Stauffenberg was summoned from Berlin to the Berghof for a second time. On this occasion, he brought British plastic explosives and time pencil fuses with him inside his briefcase. He hoped to persuade Stief to attempt an attack on Hitler during a scheduled demonstration of uniforms at Castle Klesheim near Salzburg, but Stief lost his nerve and demurred. The only plotter determined enough to attempt assassination and with direct access to Hitler was now Count von Stauffenberg. His war injuries had thus far kept him from becoming an assassin, but now he was left with no choice. Stauffenberg made his first personal attempt to kill Hitler at the Berghof on the 11th of July 1944. He had returned to the Obersalzberg for another conference, but this time had taken the precaution of stationing a plane at Salzburg airport ready to fly him straight back to Berlin once Hitler was dead. In Berlin, Olbricht was ready to illegally activate Operation Valkyrie once he had received news that Stauffenberg had successfully secured the Führer's demise. The bomb, again inside Stauffenberg's briefcase, was carried into Hitler's presence without his SS bodyguards being any the wiser. But Stauffenberg noticed that Himmler was absent from the meeting. In a quiet conversation with General Stief, his fellow plotter persuaded him to postpone the attack until such time as the entire Nazi leadership was present. Stauffenberg reluctantly agreed, completed his briefing, and left for Berlin. On reflection, he felt that he should have killed Hitler when he had had the opportunity and allowed the replacement army to deal with Himmler and the SS. A bomb inside the large living room at the Berghof would probably have succeeded. Hitler had once again escaped death. Stauffenberg was not prepared to wait much longer. In the meantime, Hitler had changed headquarters once again, moving back to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and it was here that Stauffenberg was given another opportunity to kill the Führer and enact Operation Valkyrie. Colonel Klaus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg, carefully placed his brown leather briefcase against one of the thick wooden table supports, making sure that it was as close to Adolf Hitler as he dared. The hot and stuffy conference room was crowded with senior officers, aides, and stenographers, the huge wooden table festooned with maps and charts. Hitler, pale and drawn and wearing spectacles, stood halfway along the table listening to the latest bad news from the Russian front. His marked stoop and greying hair made him look older than 55. It was evident to all those gathered in the room that the Führer was becoming increasingly agitated, as Generalleutnant Adolf Heusinger, Chief of the General Staff of the Army, presented his pessimistic strategic assessment and recommendations for the Eastern Front. The conference hut windows were open, for it was another hot and sticky day deep in the marshy East Prussian forest. The date was the 20th of July 1944, and Hitler had only minutes to live. Stauffenberg stood a few paces from his Führer, standing next to 37-year-old Oberst Heinz Brandt, Heusinger's aide and a brilliant equestrian who had won a gold medal at the 1936 Olympics. Stauffenberg's calm exterior masked his rising panic. Stauffenberg was the epitome, the kind of Wagnerian hero so adored by the Nazis. The Count was handsome, with a military bearing, but horribly disfigured by his war injuries. He wore a black eye patch, and his right hand was missing from the wrist. Most of the fingers of his left hand were also gone. This crippled but proud warrior represented the last chance for Germany. Both Stauffenberg and his fellow plotters had come so close to killing Hitler on numerous occasions. They felt sure that Hitler's uncanny ability to sidestep death could not last forever. One of their attempts would be bound to get him. Inside Stauffenberg's briefcase was a bomb, a British bomb. It was the same slab of explosives that had already been unsuccessfully used to try and destroy Hitler's plane over the Soviet Union in 1943. Stuck into the plastic sea was a British time pencil chemical fuse, and it had already been crushed. Acid was slowly eating through a spring holding back a firing pin. A detonation was imminent, but the weapon was not precise. It could go off early due to the warm temperatures of the Wolf's Lair. Stauffenberg knew he had only a few minutes to leave the conference hut before the bomb detonated. Stauffenberg had no intention of dying alongside his Führer. He intended to survive, so that he could play a central role in the military coup to be launched against the Nazi state in the wake of Hitler's successful assassination, Operation Valkyrie. He glanced to his left at his target, the maniac who was dragging sacred Germany into the abyss. Stauffenberg's face betrayed no emotion. He looked around at Generalfeldmarschall Keitel's adjutant, Major John von Freyand, and muttered something about a telephone call. Freyand and Stauffenberg stepped out of the conference. They went into the telephone operator's room, where a call was placed to Generalmajor Erich Fellgiebel's nearby communication center. "This is Stauffenberg," he announced curtly into the phone, appeared to listen for a few seconds, then calmly replaced the receiver in its cradle. Not pausing to retrieve his cap and belt with its holstered automatic pistol, Stauffenberg quickly left the conference building and started to walk towards his staff car parked close by outside. He expected the deafening explosion at any second. This time Hitler would not escape his fate. Stauffenberg had been presented with an opportunity to attack Hitler at the Wolf's Lair because he was a member of the Führer's inner staff. However, even someone as trusted as the Count faced virtually overwhelming obstacles to kill Hitler. Security at the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters was formidable in comparison to the discreet arrangements at Berchtesgaden. It was designed to be overt and intimidating, so that visitors were in no doubt that they were entering Hitler's nerve center for his most important front. It was also relatively close to the front, so security had to be tight to prevent a surprise Soviet attack. SS Begleitkommando and RSD personnel guarded all the conference rooms. On the morning of the 20th of July, Stauffenberg was to have had a meeting with General de Infanterie Walter Bühler, Chief of Staff of OKW, in Jodel's house within Sperrkreis 1, the Security Zone 1. Afterwards, the participants attended another meeting in Keitel's bunker. Stauffenberg was then due to report on new replacement army units at the Führer's midday situation conference. At 12:30 p.m., Keitel's adjutant, Major von Freyend, reported that Generalleutnant Heusinger, who was due to deliver a report on the Eastern Front at the conference, had just arrived on the trolley from the nearby Mauerwald headquarters complex. Keitel announced that it was time to go to Hitler's Situation Room near the gas bunker. At this point, Stauffenberg managed to excuse himself from the group, as Major von Freyend led him to somewhere private where he could wash his face and change his shirt. Freyend led him to a private room, but Stauffenberg appeared again shortly afterwards looking for his aide, Oberleutnant Werner von Heften, who was carrying the bomb materials in his briefcase. While Stauffenberg and von Heften worked feverishly to put their bomb together, Keitel and the others waited outside the building. Stauffenberg, who only had 3 fingers on his one remaining hand, struggled to crush the time pencil fuse that Heften had pushed into the 1-kilo slab of plastic explosive. Using specially prepared pincers, Stauffenberg managed to set the fuse off. At this point, an orderly, Sergeant Major Werner Vogel, tried to enter the room to find out why Stauffenberg was taking so long. The Count was nervous and curtly ordered him out, but Major von Freyend called out from the front of the building, "Herr Oberst Stauffenberg, do come along now." Stauffenberg quickly left the room with only 1 bomb prepared, armed and fused, stuffed into his briefcase, while von Heften still had the other slab of explosives and time pencil. Keitel, having grown impatient waiting for Stauffenberg, had gone on to the conference hut, but the Count quickly joined Freyend and the others and started walking towards the security gate. Freyend offered to carry Stauffenberg's briefcase for him, but the Count, looking tense, curtly refused. But as they approached the security gate that led into Sperrkreis A, or Security Zone A, Stauffenberg handed the briefcase and its live bomb to Freyend and asked him to place him as close to the Führer as possible because his injuries had left him hard of hearing. Outside the conference hut was an SS Begleitkommando sentry, and nearby lurked an RSD officer on patrol. Inside, a sergeant of the FBB, the Army Protection Service for Hitler, manned the building's telephone switchboard. As the officers entered the hut, they removed their caps and belts with their holstered service pistols and placed them on racks outside the conference room. No one's briefcase was searched, and Hitler's bodyguards did not frisk the visitors for weapons. A few days after the bombing, the RSD, the Reich Sicherheitsdienst, or Reich Security Service, concluded its report on the incident, writing, "Any failure of security measures provided against an assassination attempt cannot be discovered, since the possibility had never been taken into consideration that a general staff officer who was summoned to the Situation Conference would lend his hand to such a crime." There were 2 SS officers present in the room. SS Sturmbannführer, or Major Otto Günscher, Hitler's personal aide, and SS Gruppenführer, or General Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's SS liaison at Führer headquarters. The other 20 men in the room were all Army or Navy officers, apart from 2 shorthand writers who would record everything that was said, a Minister Franz von Sonnleitner, Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop's liaison man. Field Marshal Keitel introduced Stauffenberg to Hitler, who shook his mangled hand briefly before turning back to the conference table. Stauffenberg excused himself from the meeting barely 2 minutes after stepping into the room, on the pretext of making a telephone call. Stauffenberg asked Freyend to arrange the connection for the call that he said he still had to make to Feldgiebel. Freyend did as he was asked, and Stauffenberg was left alone in the telephone operator's room to speak to Feldgiebel. As soon as Freyend had gone back into the briefing, Stauffenberg hung up and left the building. When Stauffenberg left the conference room, Hitler was leaning on the table, his chin cupped with one hand, his elbow on the desk, as Generalleutnant Heusinger described the worsening situation on the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg walked out of the building and across to where Feldgiebel waited in the doorway of the communications center with Lieutenant von Heften. At 12:50 p.m., just as Stauffenberg reached the building, a loud detonation went off behind him in the direction of the conference hut. Oberleutnant Ludolf Sander, a communications officer in Feldgiebel's department, was standing near to Stauffenberg and von Heften when the bomb went off. The Count and his adjutant were anxiously making arrangements for a car. The explosion was deafening. Feldgiebel gave Stauffenberg a startled look, but the Count just shrugged his shoulders. Sander was unsurprised by the detonation. Tens of thousands of mines had been sown around the Wolf's Lair complex, and wild animals often set them off by accident. The explosion inside the conference hut was tremendous, the British Plastic Sea explosive packing a mighty punch. Flames, debris and bodies were flung through the open windows, while the detonation reverberated off the surrounding buildings. All hell broke loose as security personnel, shouting at the tops of their voices, raced towards the hut, and an alarm siren started its mournful wail. FBB medics rushed to tend the injured, while Stauffenberg and von Heften hurried towards a nearby staff car. The two plotters witnessed the scene of confusion as a huge cloud of black smoke and dust completely obscured the conference hut. Several guards looked skyward, expecting to hear the drone of aircraft engines, for it seemed as though the bomb had to have come from above. Stauffenberg climbed into the back of the black Mercedes, believing that no one in the conference room could have survived such a catastrophic detonation. Inside Hitler's conference hut, the pleasant room had been reduced to a complete shambles. The huge map table had collapsed and was partly on fire. Bits of paper and dust twirled in the disturbed air. The walls and ceiling had also partially collapsed, and the window frames had disintegrated, with wood and glass spread over the grass outside. But the bomb had not done its work. Stenographer Dr. Heinrich Berger had taken the full blast of Stauffenberg's bomb, losing both of his legs. He died later that day. Colonel Brandt lost one of his legs and died the following day. Generaloberst Gunther Korten, chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe, was speared by a piece of wood and also died the next day. Chief of the Army Staff Office, Generalmajor Rudolf Schmundt, was severely wounded, losing an eye and a leg, and also suffered burns to his face. He died in hospital several weeks after the attack. But most of the participants survived with injuries that ranged from serious to superficial. Unfortunately for Stauffenberg and the plotters, Hitler fell into the latter category. The problem for Stauffenberg was the venue. If the Situation Conference had been held in the windowless concrete Führerbunker, the explosive power of the 1 kilo charge would have been magnified and probably killed everyone in the room. But because of the stifling July heat, the venue had been changed to the cool and shady conference hut. The use of the term hut is a little disingenuous, as it was built of concrete and brick, but it had large windows and was wood and plaster lined, so some of the power of the blast dissipated through the windows and doors or was absorbed by the plaster and wood interior. Hitler was blown off his feet by the blast. After the initial shock of the blast, Hitler, a veteran of the trenches, established that he was all in one piece and that he could move. He made it through the wreckage to the door, beating flames out from his trousers and the back of his head as he went. He bumped into Field Marshal Keitel, who embraced him, weeping and crying out, "My Führer, you are alive! You are alive!" Keitel helped Hitler outside. Hitler's singed hair stood on end, his trousers and long white underwear had been shredded and hung in strips like a raffia skirt, and his legs bled from hundreds of wooden splinters that had flown around the room like high-velocity needles. His face was blackened, and he was deaf in one ear, his eardrum ruptured by the blast. He also had bad bruising to his hands and a hemorrhaged elbow because he was leaning on the table when the bomb had exploded. His right arm was swollen and painful, and he could barely lift it. He also had cuts to his forehead. But he was very much alive, and none of his injuries was life-threatening. As with so many things in Hitler's life, his survival had been purely by chance. After Stauffenberg had left the room to answer his telephone call, Colonel Brandt's boot had connected with the Count's briefcase. To clear some standing space, Brandt, who was standing closest to Hitler, had leaned down and moved the briefcase to the other side of one of the very thick oak table supports, away from Hitler. If the bomb had remained where it was, Hitler would almost certainly have been killed. As it was, the table's support absorbed much of the bomb's blast, leaving Hitler with only superficial injuries. Stauffenberg had also only been able to arm one of the 2 slabs of plastic explosives that he had carried into the Wolf's Lair after being disturbed when he and his aide had been priming the time pencil fuse. The other slab remained in von Heften's possession as they drove away from the scene of the crime in the staff car. Dr. Theodor Morell soon arrived to begin treating Hitler's wounds. When the Führer's valet, Heinz Linger, rushed to his master's side, he was surprised to find Hitler composed and with a grim smile on his face. "Linger, someone has tried to kill me," said Hitler. The identity of that someone had yet to emerge. Stauffenberg's car passed through the checkpoints out of Security Zone 1 without any problems, the Count bluffing the guards, muttering something about Führer orders of the highest priority. The guards should not have let the car pass, but they were still reeling with confusion after the nearby bomb blast. When Stauffenberg and von Heften arrived at Watchpost South, the southern guardhouse and the perimeter fence, they found their path to freedom was blocked. The FBB army personnel manning the gates had dropped the barrier and placed obstacles across the road. The NCO in charge resolutely refused to let the plotters pass. Stauffenberg, feigning anger at such an insufferable delay, got out of the Mercedes and paced into the guardroom, where he telephoned his breakfast companion, Captain Leonhard von Möhlendorf, who worked in the HQ Commandant building. After repeating his story about Führer's orders, von Möhlendorf interceded on Stauffenberg's behalf and ordered the guard commander to open the gates. Speeding through, Stauffenberg and von Heften headed for the airfield, where General Wagner had placed a Heinkel HE-111 transport at his disposal. Within a few minutes, they were on their way to Berlin, confident that Hitler was no more and ready to take charge of the coup. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler continued to receive treatment from his personal physician, Dr. Morell. When Hitler had been dragged from the burning and ruined conference hut, General Feldgiebel had been watching from in front of the guest bunker, trying to ascertain whether Hitler was alive or dead. Later, Feldgiebel fell into conversation with Generaloberst Jodl, remarking about the attack. "You see, this comes from being so close to the front lines." Jodl retorted sharply, "No, this comes from the HQ being a construction site." It appeared that by this stage most of Hitler's entourage believed that the bomb had been planted by one of the several hundred Organisation Todt workers who were labouring at the Wolf's Lair. But suspicion would soon fall on Colonel von Stauffenberg when it was noticed that he was missing from the headquarters, and he had been seen leaving by the switchboard operator without his briefcase. Hitler, rather than being downhearted or depressed by his latest close call with death, was ecstatic. As Morell patched him up, he kept repeating, "I am invulnerable. I am immortal." It was indeed some sort of miracle that Hitler survived such a powerful explosion only feet from him. Many would attribute Hitler's survival once again to having his own guardian devil. The RSD immediately sealed off the ruined conference hut and began a forensic investigation of the scene in order to gather evidence. The Führerbunker was also sealed off and very carefully searched for explosives. The entire Wolf's Lair complex was placed on high alert. Over the coming days, security was considerably tightened, meaning that Stauffenberg's failure would actually make it even harder to kill the Führer. Stauffenberg's coup attempt began to unravel very quickly. While he was aboard the plane, taking him to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, a 2-hour flight from Rustenburg, he was identified as the assassin. General Feldgiebel had severed all communications to and from Führer headquarters. or at least thought that he had. Feldgiebel had sent off one short message to Generalmajor Fritz Thiele, communications officer at Army High Command in Berlin, stating that Hitler was still alive. No further details were given. Later, further messages came through that something had happened at the Wolf's Lair, but that Hitler had survived. Hitler had summoned Himmler and Goering to the Führerbunker, and he had placed Himmler in command of the replacement army. At the Bendler Block, replacement army headquarters in Berlin, General Ulbricht concluded that to take action before having definitive news would be to court disaster, and his resulting inaction caused a lot of time to be lost. At the Bendler Block, Generaloberst Fromm had been growing increasingly concerned about what was happening at the Wolf's Lair. Fromm got through to Field Marshal Keitel at 4 p.m., 30 minutes before Stauffenberg landed at Tempelhof Airport. Keitel informed Fromm that there had been a bomb, but that Hitler had suffered only minor injuries. Keitel also asked him about Stauffenberg's whereabouts. Then Stauffenberg phoned from the airport insisting that Hitler was dead. When Stauffenberg and Lieutenant von Heften had landed, they had discovered that there was nobody to meet them, not even a car and driver. It was a bad sign. The Count was forced to make his own way to headquarters, where he found the mood to be cautious and hesitant. Stauffenberg managed to pull the plotters together for a while, sending out a flurry of orders. He gave his colleagues an account of Hitler's death, admitting that he had planted the bomb. No one who was in that room can still be alive, he asserted. Ulbricht demanded that Fromm sign the alert order for Operation Valkyrie, but Fromm, having spoken to Keitel, knew that a coup was being attempted, and he refused. Oberst Ritter Merz von Kernheim, one of Stauffenberg's plotters, grew impatient at the delay and faked the alert order himself. When Fromm tried to have von Kernheim arrested, Stauffenberg instead placed Fromm under arrest and had him locked in his apartment in the building. Operation Valkyrie was activated, with units of the replacement army surrounding or occupying all offices of the Nazi state and SS, including in the regions and foreign capitals under German occupation. In Paris, General de Infanterie Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel and his subordinate officers firmly backed the coup, but the supreme commander in the West, Generalfeldmarschall Günther von Kluge, vacillated. Generaloberst Ludwig Beck, who had arrived at the Bendler Block, tried to persuade Kluge on the telephone to back the coup, but failed. The plotters also failed to order the troops to seize the Nazi broadcast and communications network, or to arrest senior SS and party leaders. Keitel and Jodl at the Wolf's Lair began to issue a stream of counter-orders, along with Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler, all firmly scotching rumours of a coup against Hitler by the party and the SS. Most began with the chilling sentence, "The Führer is alive, in perfect health." Regardless of Stauffenberg's assurances that Hitler was dead, the stream of messages to the contrary from the Wolf's Lair caused confusion and vacillation at the Bendler Block. Generalmajor Stief started informing on his fellow plotters, while Ulbricht had clearly lost heart. By mid-evening the coup was faltering. When Field Marshal Kluge received word that Hitler was still alive, he immediately overrode General von Stülpnagel's orders in Paris to arrest all SS, SD and Gestapo officials, dismissed von Stülpnagel from his post, and denounced him to Field Marshal Keitel at the Wolf's Lair. Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry was surrounded by replacement army troops who genuinely thought that the Nazi Party was attempting a coup against Hitler. Goebbels had first become aware that something was very wrong at between 2 and 3 p.m. that afternoon, when he had been awakened from his usual afternoon nap by a telephone call from Wilfried von Oven, head of the press office. Oven had just finished a call from an agitated Heinz Lorenz, deputy to Hitler's press secretary, Dr. Otto Dietrich, informing him of the events at the Wolf's Lair and issuing the text for a radio announcement from Hitler to the German people denouncing the coup. It was clear to Goebbels that the army was involved in some kind of uprising. Goebbels frantically telephoned around, trying to make sense of what was happening. Eventually, he got through to Hitler, who told him that the army was launching a putsch against him. Goebbels later called Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer over to his office and told him that a full-scale putsch was underway. Speer immediately offered Goebbels his help. It was then that Goebbels and Speer noticed replacement army troops were moving to cordon off the propaganda ministry building. Goebbels was also concerned that he could not locate Himmler, and also slightly suspicious that perhaps Himmler might be a part of the coup. Goebbels summoned the commander of the troops surrounding the ministry, Major Otto Rehmer, a 32-year-old committed Nazi. He had taken the precaution of placing a small box of cyanide capsules into his tunic pocket before the meeting in case the plotters arrested him. When Rehmer explained that he had been ordered by the city commandant, Generalleutnant Paul von Haase, to cordon off the government district because Hitler was dead, Goebbels retorted, "The Führer is alive. I spoke with him a few minutes ago." Rehmer began to realize that he and his men had been duped. Goebbels got Hitler on the phone and handed the receiver to Rehmer. "Do you hear me? So I'm alive. The attempt has failed," said Hitler in a chilling voice. "A tiny clique of ambitious officers wanted to do away with me. But now we have the saboteurs at the front. We'll make short shrift of this plague. You are commanded by me the task of immediately restoring calm and security in the Reich capital, if necessary by force. You are under my personal command for this purpose until the Reichsführer SS arrives in the Reich capital." Rehmer understood perfectly and went straight to work, moving his troops over to surround the Bendler block instead of the propaganda ministry after Goebbels had personally addressed the men in the ministry garden. Nazi officials were released and the Nazi state reasserted itself. At 6:30 p.m., Goebbels delivered a radio broadcast announcing that Hitler was alive and well. Between 8 and 9 p.m., the army cordon around the government district was lifted. Later in the evening, the coup was finished, with just a handful of the original plotters holed up in the Bendler block. Arguments began to break out among the plotters and those officers who had found themselves inside the building but were not connected with the plot. A group of staff officers, led by Oberstleutnant Franz Herber, who had not been party to the plot, armed themselves and marched to Ulbricht's room. As they were talking to General Ulbricht, shots were fired in the corridor outside, and from the resulting melee, Stauffenberg was shot in the shoulder. Herber and his men pressed into General Fromm's office, where Stauffenberg and Generaloberst Erich Höppner, former commander of the 4th Panzer Army on the Eastern Front until dismissed and retired by Hitler in 1942, had retreated. Herber demanded to speak to Fromm, who had been placed under guard in his apartment after his refusal to enact Operation Valkyrie. A rebellious officer went and told Fromm what had happened. Liberated, Fromm had the arrested plotters brought before him. "Well, gentlemen, now I am going to do to you what you wanted to do to me this afternoon." Fromm charged the plotters with high treason. Found guilty, they were sentenced to death. It was later discovered by the Gestapo that Fromm acted with such haste because he wanted to distance himself from the fact that he knew all about Stauffenberg's plot, but had chosen to remain silent, waiting to see which way the chips fell. Now, Fromm decided to eliminate the witnesses to this fact and ingratiate himself with Hitler. He had also been informed that Himmler was on his way to take command. Ludwig Beck attempted to commit suicide with a pistol that Fromm permitted him to retain for this purpose. General Beck only managed to graze his forehead with the first shot. Trying again, Beck shot himself in the head, but he did not die. Instead, he writhed in agony on the floor of the office until Fromm had an army sergeant unceremoniously drag the grievously wounded general by his legs into an adjoining room, where the NCO finished him off himself. Around midnight, Fromm gave the following order to a subordinate: Take a few men and execute the sentence downstairs in the yard at once. Stauffenberg, von Felton, Olbricht, and Oberst von Kernheim, Fromm's former chief of staff, were taken out into the Bendler block's courtyard and summarily shot by firing squad in front of a large pile of building sand. Stauffenberg's last words before he was killed have gone down in history. Long live sacred Germany! Resistance to Hitler was ruthlessly purged, with most of those involved in the July plot exposed, arrested, tried, and executed. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was to have become head of state if the coup had succeeded, was slowly strangled at Plotensee prison with piano wire wound round a meat hook. Dr. Karl Goerdeler and Erich Fellgiebel suffered the same fate, the hangings being filmed for Hitler to watch. General Henning von Tresckow decided upon suicide, going to the front in Russia and exploding a hand grenade beneath his chin. General Eduard Wagner also committed suicide, shooting himself in the head 3 days after the plot failed, before the Gestapo could arrest him. Among the many thousands who were arrested and murdered was General Friedrich Fromm. His quick execution of Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Felton, and Kernheim could not save him from arrest. The Gestapo failed to find enough proof linking him directly to the plot, so he was instead charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy. Fromm was shot on the 12th of March 1945. Following the attack on Hitler, security at his headquarters was considerably strengthened. One noticeable result of the July bomb plot was Hitler's increasing reliance upon the SS to guard him. The army's good name had been considerably tarnished at Führer headquarters by the incident, and even the FBB, the army's Führer Protection Unit, was held in some suspicion. After all, the FBB's founder and first commander, Erwin Rommel, was also revealed to have been part of the July plot, with serious consequences for Germany's most famous soldier. New security procedures were also introduced for all those who were to be in the Führer's presence. For the first time, all briefcases were to be carefully checked, and military officers were forbidden from wearing any weapons in Hitler's presence, a new rule that extended to ceremonial daggers and swords. 1 day after the new regulations came into force, the arrival of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop's adjutant at the Wolf's Lair created a major incident. Captain Otting carried a briefcase that contained secret and sensitive Reich documents, and a rule stated that the holder of the briefcase had to also keep the means at hand to destroy those documents immediately if the need arose. In adherence to this regulation, when the RSD opened Otting's briefcase for examination, they discovered a number of secret files, and tucked in beside them was a hand grenade and a small flask of petrol. Needless to say, the regulation was quietly ignored, but from then on such articles were never brought into the Wolf's Lair again. Following Stauffenberg's bomb, visitors were now required to turn out the contents of their trouser and tunic pockets for inspection by the RSD, and in a final humiliation, visitors were frisked. This new rule went down very badly with professional army officers, but in the climate of fear that followed the bombing attempt, no one was likely to publicly complain. The RSD even considered using an X-ray machine to examine briefcases and other packages more closely. Although security around Hitler was considerably tightened, lapses still occurred. For example, at the end of July, Hitler suddenly decided to visit those who had been injured in the conference hut bombing and were being treated at Rastenburg Reserve Hospital in Karlshof, a treatment center for wounded soldiers. Hitler travelled by motorcade, as was his usual custom, sitting in the front passenger seat of the first open-top black Mercedes next to his driver, while several SS adjutants rode in the back. In a departure from usual practice, on both running boards and standing on the back of the car were SS Begleitkommando armed with machine pistols. 2 more black cars followed Hitler's, each filled with armed SS. They drove at around 55 kilometers an hour. Hitler arrived at the hospital completely unannounced and was mobbed by convalescing soldiers the moment he stepped down from his Mercedes. Many of these crippled veterans had good measure to wish for harm to come to the man who had caused their injuries, but even at this late stage of the war, most German soldiers remained loyal to their Führer, and Hitler was only bothered for photographs. Hitler's valet, Heinz Linger, was horrified by the risks his boss took. Any of them could have killed him had they been so inclined. Although still suffering from wounds to his head and legs from the bomb, he was so unmoved by it all that I became anxious for his safety and only relaxed when we finally drove off, Linger said. On the 19th of September, Hitler was himself admitted to the same hospital for an X-ray. This time, RSD and SS Begleitkommando bodyguards descended upon the hospital an hour before Hitler arrived, carefully searched all of the rooms that the Führer would use, and posted guards at all of the entrances. The Führer arrived at the head of a 3-car motorcade accompanied by his aides and adjutants. Hitler did not look well. His face was pale and covered with loosely hanging flesh. Hitler himself complained that his doctors were a bad lot and that matter was still dripping internally from his ear. Hitler had suffered a burst eardrum in the bombing onto his tongue. It was also noticeable that one of Hitler's hips was causing him pain. One of Hitler's doctors noticed something strange at the Wolf's Lair when he was summoned to the Führerbunker on the 1st of October 1944 to examine the Führer. Hitler would complain of various medical problems caused by Stauffenberg's bomb and required regular examinations and visits by doctors. On this occasion, the doctor noticed that there was an automatic pistol on the night table beside Hitler's bed. When Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, noticed the doctor staring at it, he quickly put it out of sight inside a cupboard. Perhaps Linger thought that the doctor was tempted to snatch up the weapon and finish what Stauffenberg had begun. Following the bombing, there was a fair amount of recrimination amongst the senior officers around Hitler. Field Marshal von Kluge had been relieved of his command and replaced by Walter Model on the 17th of August. Recalled to Berlin for a meeting with Hitler, von Kluge rightly suspected that he would be arrested and punished over his links to the Stauffenberg plot in Paris. So during the journey by car to Germany, he had his driver pull over near Metz. Claiming that he was going to relieve himself, von Kluge took a cyanide pill. He was 61. Rommel, the desert fox and a national hero, required careful handling. Knowing that a public trial would damage Hitler's standing with his people, the Führer decided that the 52-year-old Field Marshal Rommel would be quietly disposed of. General Burgdorf was one of the 2 generals sent to persuade Rommel to kill himself. The Field Marshal took cyanide after being assured that his family would not be persecuted. He was given a state funeral, and a statement was issued to the public explaining that Rommel had succumbed to injuries sustained in a car crash after his staff vehicle had been strafed by a Spitfire in Normandy. The best opportunity to kill Hitler had been missed with the failure of Count von Stauffenberg's bomb. The resulting roundups, show trials and executions deeply alarmed the German officer corps and ensured their almost complete loyalty for the rest of the war. Hitler was soon on the move again, headed to the west, where he would attempt to change the outcome of the war with one last desperate roll of the dice, the Ardennes offensive. You have been listening to Kill Hitler, the July Bomb Plot, written and narrated by Mark Felton. For great videos on many World War II subjects, visit my YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.